Hello, and welcome to History at Night. Tonight, we are going somewhere that the ancient world once called the most dangerous city on Earth. A place so powerful, so wealthy, so terrifyingly close to destroying everything Rome had ever built, that when it was finally gone, Rome made sure there would be nothing left to remember it by. Not the temples, not the libraries, not even the ground itself. They salted the earth, or so the story goes, so that nothing would ever grow there again. And yet here we are, thousands of years later, still talking about it, still trying to understand it, still feeling the weight of what it meant and what was lost when it burned. This is the story of Carthage, Rome's greatest enemy, the city that dared to make the Mediterranean its own, the civilization that produced one of the most brilliant military minds in all of human history, and the culture that was erased so completely that we still do not know exactly what its people called themselves in their own language, what songs they sang at night, or what stories they told their children before sleep. Tonight, we are going to find it, or as much of it as still exists. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. Now settle in. Let the noise of the modern world grow quiet around you. We are going a very long way back tonight, back past Rome, back past Greece, back to the age of the first great sea traders, the people who crossed open water in the dark and called it business, back to the beginning of Carthage. And at the beginning, there is a woman. Her name was Alyssa. Some called her Dido. She was a princess of Tyre, one of the most powerful cities in the ancient Phoenician world, and she was running for her life. Tyre was a city built on a small island, off the coast of what is now Lebanon. It sat in the sea like a jewel, protected by water on all sides, and it had grown enormously rich from trade. The Phoenicians were the great sailors of their age. They had no vast armies, no conquered territories stretching across continents. What they had was wood, skill, and the sea. They built ships that could carry enormous loads across open water, and they sailed them everywhere, to Egypt for grain, to Spain for silver, to the tin mines of distant Britain for the metal that hardened bronze. The Phoenicians had trading colonies stretched across the entire Mediterranean coast, small outposts of commerce planted like seeds in foreign soil. Tyre was the queen of all of them. But Tyre, like every prosperous place in the ancient world, was not immune to the violence of family. When Alyssa's father, the king of Tyre, died, he left his kingdom jointly to Alyssa and her brother, a man named Pygmalion. The arrangement did not last. Pygmalion wanted everything. He murdered Alyssa's husband, a wealthy and powerful priest, to get his hands on the temple treasury, and then he came for the rest. Alyssa was not the kind of woman who waited to be destroyed. She gathered a group of Tyrian nobles who were equally terrified of Pygmalion, and she organized a fleet. She took with her the temple treasures, a group of priests, and several boatloads of people who preferred exile over death. According to legend, she also outwitted her brother one last time. She loaded the ships with heavy bags and had them dumped into the sea, while Pygmalion's men watched from the shore. His spies had been told the bags contained gold, the treasure Pygmalion desperately wanted. They were actually filled with sand. While Pygmalion's soldiers scrambled uselessly at the water's edge, Alyssa sailed away. Where she was going was the question. The Phoenicians had already established colonies all along the North African coast, so Alyssa was sailing toward familiar territory. She stopped first at Cyprus, where she gathered 80 young women to come with the refugees. These women would become wives for the men of the new colony. She picked up more supplies, more followers, more people who wanted to start again somewhere new, and then she sailed west, toward the coast of what is now Tunisia. The land she found there was occupied by a Berber people called the Libyans. Their king was named Iarbas. The story says that Alyssa negotiated with him in one of the most famous moments of clever bargaining in all of ancient history. She asked only for as much land as could be covered by a single ox hide. Iarbas, perhaps amused by the modest request, agreed, and Alyssa proceeded to cut the ox hide into a single continuous strip, so thin it was almost a thread, and laid it out to encircle an entire hilltop overlooking the bay. She had asked for the skin of one ox. She had claimed enough land for a city. The hilltop she chose was called Barca. It meant citadel. And on that hill, around 814 BCE, Elissa founded the city that the Phoenicians called Carthage, the new city. The city we know as Carthage. Whether this story is entirely true is something historians still debate. The legend of Elissa and the ox hide is preserved mostly in Roman and Greek sources, written centuries after the fact, and coloured by the storytelling traditions of cultures that were not Carthaginian. Carthage itself left very little written history behind, because Rome made sure of that. But the story of a Tyrian princess founding the city survives, and it has the feeling of something that carries a real memory at its heart. The cleverness, the desperation, the woman who refused to be a victim of the men around her and instead built something that would outlast all of them. Elissa, the ancient sources tell us, eventually became Carthage's first queen, and when Iarbas pressed her to marry him, threatening war if she refused, she chose instead to build a great funeral pyre, climb onto it, and die on her own terms, rather than surrender her city's independence through a marriage she did not want. Whether it happened that way or not, the city she left behind was real, and it grew in ways she probably could not have imagined. The location she had chosen was extraordinary. The hilltop of Barca sat on a peninsula that jutted out into the Bay of Tunis, protected by water on three sides. To the east was the deep harbour, to the north a shallow saltwater lagoon, and to the south flat farmland stretching toward the interior. From this one spot, a ship could reach almost any point in the western Mediterranean within a few days of sailing. It was not just a defensible position, it was a gateway. For the first century or so, Carthage was simply another Phoenician trading colony. It paid tribute to Tyre. It operated within the network of Phoenician commerce. It was a way station, a place to stop and resupply on the long routes between the eastern Mediterranean and the trading posts in Spain and Sardinia. But Tyre was changing. In the east, empires were rising and falling with terrifying speed. The Assyrians conquered Tyre, then the Babylonians came, then the Persians. Each time a new conqueror arrived, the Phoenician cities of the eastern coast were either destroyed, subjugated, or squeezed for tribute. The great trading network they had built began to fray at its eastern end, and as the homeland weakened, the colonies it had planted in the west began to look at each other differently. Not as outposts, waiting for instructions from home, but as something that might stand on its own. Carthage was the largest of these western colonies, and at some point, probably in the 6th century BCE, it stopped being a colony and started being an empire. The transformation was not sudden. There was no single moment when Carthage declared independence, no founding document, no revolution. It was more like water, slowly finding its own level. The tribute to Tyre stopped. The connections with the Phoenician homeland weakened into something more like cultural memory than political obligation. And Carthage began to do what cities in powerful positions have always done. It reached outward. It took control of the other Phoenician colonies in North Africa first, small places like Utica and Leptis Magna. Then it moved into Sardinia, planting its own garrisons in the Phoenician settlements there, then western Sicily, which had been a Phoenician trading zone for centuries. And then the Balearic Islands, off the coast of Spain. Each expansion was calculated. Each new territory brought resources, port access, and control of critical shipping lanes. By the 5th century BCE, Carthage was not a trading post. It was the master of the western Mediterranean. Its navy was the most powerful force on those waters. Its merchant fleet was larger than any other in the known world. And its city had grown into something that travelers from Greece and Rome described with barely concealed awe. The ancient writers who visited or heard accounts of Carthage described a city of extraordinary beauty and sophistication. The harbour complex was one of the wonders of the ancient world. There were 2 harbours, one commercial and one military, arranged in a configuration that had never been seen before. The commercial harbour was a large rectangular basin where merchant ships could dock and unload. Connected to it, through a narrow channel, was the military harbour. And at the centre of the military harbour was something almost magical. A circular island, man-made, on which stood a vast covered arsenal. The admiral's headquarters. Ships were stored in covered slips around the entire circumference of the harbour. 220 ships could be housed and maintained there simultaneously, hidden from outside view, protected, ready. The city itself climbed from the harbours up the hill of Barca. There were blocks of multi-storey houses, some rising 6 stories high, an extraordinary height for the ancient world. There were temples, markets, workshops, public squares. The population at its peak was somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 people, which made Carthage one of the largest cities on earth at that time. Larger than Rome for much of its history, larger than any city in the Western world except Alexandria. And at the top of the hill, the citadel of Barca, where Alyssa had first laid down her ox hide, rose above everything. From up there on a clear day, you could see the sea in every direction. The people who built all this were called the Punics by the Romans. The word came from the Latin corruption of Phoenician. They called themselves, in their own Semitic language, something we cannot fully reconstruct because their books are gone. Their great library, which ancient writers tell us was enormous, did not survive the end. But we know from the fragments that remain, from inscriptions found in stone and on bronze tablets, that they spoke a language closely related to Hebrew and Aramaic, a Semitic tongue, rich and complex, full of sounds that Greek and Latin speakers found difficult to reproduce. Their religion was the religion of the Phoenician East, adapted and developed over centuries into something distinctly Carthaginian. They worshipped a pantheon of gods, but 2 stood above the others. Baal Hammon, the lord of the furnace, a god of sky and weather and power, usually depicted as an old man with a long beard and ram's horns. And beside him, Tanit, the face of Baal, his consort, the great goddess of Carthage, whose symbol, a simple triangle surmounted by a circle and a horizontal bar, was carved and painted everywhere in the city. On stones, on amulets, on the walls of sanctuaries, Tanit was beloved in a way that few ancient deities were. The people of Carthage addressed her in prayers and inscriptions, the way you might address someone you trusted completely. But the religion of Carthage also had its darkness. There is a sanctuary in Carthage called the Tophet. Archaeologists found it in the 20th century, a sacred open-air precinct not far from the harbours. In it, they found thousands of small urns. Inside the urns, burned bones, the bones of children, infants. Some of the urns also contained the bones of animals, goats, and lambs. And it has been argued that these represent substitutions, cases where an animal was offered instead of a child. But many of the urns contain only the bones of very small humans. The debate about what this means has gone on for decades. Some scholars argue that these children were sacrificed, offered alive, to Baal, Hammon, and Tanit in moments of extreme crisis, or perhaps routinely as a form of devotion. This is what the Greek and Roman sources say, and they describe it with horror. Ancient writers claimed that Carthaginian parents would place their children into the heated arms of a bronze statue and watch them roll into the fire, that the cries of the children were drowned out by the beating of drums and the playing of flutes so that the parents would not hear. Other scholars argue that the Tophet is simply a cemetery for children who died young, and that the burned bones reflect a cremation practice common in the Phoenician world. That the Romans and Greeks, who had their own deep political reasons to demonize Carthage, invented or grossly exaggerated the sacrifice stories to make their enemy seem monstrous. The truth, as with so much of Carthage, is somewhere in the uncertainty. The urns are real, the bones are real. What we cannot fully know, across the distance of 2,500 years, is what they meant to the people who placed them there. What we do know is that the Tophet is unlike anything else in the ancient Mediterranean world. And whatever it was practiced for centuries, generation after generation in the shadow of those harbours. Carthage was a city of extraordinary achievements and unsolvable mysteries. And it was also, underneath all the grandeur and the trade and the temples, a city built on a single, fundamental understanding of the world. That wealth was power, that the sea was the source of both, and that whoever controlled the sea controlled everything. For most of its early history, no one seriously challenged this. And then, slowly, from the hills above a river in central Italy, something new began to grow. Something that would change everything. The Romans were not, in the early centuries, a maritime people. They were farmers and soldiers, a people of the land. Their city sat inland, on 7 hills above the Tiber River. They fought with infantry, not ships. Their whole civilization was organized around the discipline of the Roman legion, the tight formation of armored men moving as one, a machine of war that had conquered the Italian peninsula 1 hill and 1 valley at a time. The sea was not Roman, the sea was Carthaginian. For a long time, Carthage and Rome coexisted in a kind of careful, mutual recognition. They had treaties. The oldest treaty between them, according to the Roman historian Polybius, dated to 508 BCE, just after the Romans had expelled their last king and established the Republic. The terms were straightforward. Roman ships could trade in Carthaginian waters under certain conditions. Rome would not interfere in Carthage's sphere of influence in North Africa and Sardinia, and Carthage would not interfere in Rome's sphere in Italy. It was the treaty of 2 powers who recognized each other as significant without yet feeling seriously threatened by each other. Rome was still a regional Italian power. Carthage was the master of the Western Sea. The Mediterranean was big enough for both of them, and their interests, for the moment, pointed in different directions. That would change in Sicily. Sicily was the largest island in the Mediterranean, sitting at the crossroads of the western and eastern sea routes. It had been contested territory for as long as anyone could remember. The eastern half of the island was dominated by Greek colonies, most famously the great city of Syracuse, which was rich and proud and fiercely independent. The western third of the island was Carthaginian, and in the middle there was constant, grinding friction. For centuries, Carthage and the Greek cities of Sicily had fought each other in a series of wars that never quite resolved anything. Carthage would push east, and the Greeks would push back. The Greeks would overextend, and Carthage would recover. The borders shifted, but the fundamental situation remained the same. Western Sicily was Punic, Eastern Sicily was Greek, and the middle was a permanent war zone. Then Rome finished conquering the Italian peninsula, and everything to the north of that narrow strait between Italy and Sicily suddenly looked very different from Carthage's perspective. The First Punic War began in 264 BCE, over something that, in isolation, looks almost absurdly small, a dispute in a Sicilian town called Messana, which sat at the very tip of the island, directly across the strait from the toe of the Italian boot. Messana had been seized by a group of mercenaries called the Mamertines, soldiers who had served under a Syracusan general and then, when their employment ended, decided they liked the city enough to keep it. The people of Messana were not pleased by this arrangement. The Mamertines found themselves pressed from 2 sides, Carthage offering help from the west and Rome offering help from the north. They appealed to both, and both responded, and suddenly there were Carthaginian troops and Roman troops in the same small city, both claiming to be there at the invitation of the locals, both knowing exactly what the other's presence meant. It meant that whoever blinked first would leave Sicily, and neither Carthage nor Rome was willing to leave Sicily. The war that followed lasted 23 years. 23 years of fighting across an island that neither side could afford to abandon, for an enormous variety of reasons. For Carthage, Sicily was a critical part of its commercial empire. The western ports controlled trade routes. The grain fields fed large populations. Losing Sicily would be the beginning of losing everything west of Carthage. For Rome, the decision to intervene in Sicily was a fundamental strategic reorientation. It was the moment Rome decided that Italy was not enough, that being a continental power was not sufficient, and that the sea mattered. The problem was that Rome had no navy. This is one of the most extraordinary facts of the First Punic War. When the conflict began, Rome was one of the greatest land powers in the ancient world, but it had almost no capacity to fight at sea. and the war quickly made clear that you could not control Sicily without controlling the sea around it. Carthaginian warships could land troops wherever they chose and supply them indefinitely. Roman troops on the island were vulnerable. The strategic situation demanded ships, and Rome simply did not have them. So Rome built them. The story, as the ancient sources tell it, is almost too remarkable to be believed, and yet the archaeological and historical evidence supports the broad outline. The Romans supposedly found a beached Carthaginian warship, either captured or run aground, and used it as a template. They built a fleet of roughly 120 warships in approximately 60 days. They trained their crews by having them row on benches set up on shore, practicing the stroke and rhythm before they ever touched water. And while the ships were being built, they also invented something new: the corvus, the raven. It was a spiked boarding bridge mounted on a rotating pole at the front of the Roman warship. When a Roman ship came alongside a Carthaginian vessel, the corvus would drop, the spike would punch through the enemy's deck, and the two ships would be locked together. And suddenly, a sea battle became a land battle. And Romans were very, very good at land battles. At the Battle of Mylae in 260 BCE, the Roman fleet met the Carthaginians for the first time in open water. The Carthaginian admiral, Hannibal, son of Gisco, was so confident that he sailed toward the Roman fleet without much concern. The Romans had no naval tradition. Their ships were freshly built. Their sailors were untested. Carthage had been the greatest sea power in the Mediterranean for centuries. Hannibal watched in disbelief as the Romans rammed and locked his ships one after another, the corvus doing exactly what it was designed to do. The Carthaginians lost 50 ships in a single afternoon. It was a catastrophe that should have been impossible, and it changed the entire shape of the war. But the war was still a long way from over. For the next 2 decades, it swayed back and forth. Rome won at sea and lost on land. Carthage won on land and lost at sea. Both sides attempted to take the war to the other's home territory, and both failed. A Roman expeditionary force landed in North Africa under a general named Regulus and almost reached Carthage itself before being destroyed by a Spartan mercenary commander who reorganized the Carthaginian army using Greek tactics. Rome lost enormous fleets to storms, hundreds of ships at a time, because Roman sailors and Roman shipbuilders were still learning things that Carthaginian sailors had known for generations. Carthage sent great generals to Sicily, who won battle after battle, but could not dislodge the Romans from the strategic positions they had claimed. The war dragged on, bleeding both sides of men and treasure and time. What finally ended it was a combination of exhaustion and one last desperate gamble. Rome, whose treasury had been nearly emptied and whose population had endured staggering losses, organized its citizens to fund the construction of yet another fleet. The last Carthaginian fleet in Sicilian waters was caught off the Aegates Islands in 241 BCE by a Roman force under the consul Gaius Lutatius Catulus. The Carthaginian ships were heavily loaded with supplies meant for their garrisons on the island. They were slow and underprepared for battle. The Romans sank or captured almost the entire fleet. Carthage had no ships left to defend Sicily, no money to build more, and its general in Sicily, a man named Hannibal Barca, was trapped on the island with his army and no way home. The peace terms were harsh. Carthage surrendered Sicily entirely. It agreed to pay a substantial indemnity to Rome over the next 10 years, and it agreed to release all Roman prisoners without ransom. Hannibal Barca marched his undefeated army down from its mountain stronghold in Sicily, negotiated passage for them on transport ships, and sailed home. He was not the kind of man who accepted defeat as final. Hannibal Barca was one of the most remarkable military figures of the ancient world, and also one of the most obscure. The Romans wrote about him mostly in the context of what his son later did, treating him as a prologue rather than a story in himself. But the ancient sources preserve enough to sketch the outline of a man of extraordinary ability and extraordinary anger. He had held western Sicily against Rome for years, with minimal support from Carthage, fighting a guerrilla war from the mountains that the Romans could never fully extinguish. He was not defeated in Sicily. He was surrendered in a diplomatic settlement He had no part in negotiating, handed over by the oligarchs in Carthage, who had decided the war was too expensive and who were, Hamilcar believed, too comfortable with defeat. When he returned to Carthage, he found a city in crisis. The mercenary soldiers who had fought for Carthage during the war had not been paid. Carthage, as was standard for Punic military practice, used large numbers of mercenaries, soldiers hired from all over the Mediterranean world: Libyans, Iberians, Gauls, Greeks, Numidians. These men were owed significant back pay, and with the war over and Carthage weakened by the indemnity payments to Rome, the Carthaginian government kept delaying. The mercenaries grew restless, then angry, then violent. What began as a wage dispute became a full-scale war. The Mercenary War, as it is called, lasted from 241 to 237 BCE. It was one of the most savage conflicts of the ancient world, a war fought between a city-state and its own former soldiers that degenerated into mutual atrocity. The mercenaries tortured and crucified Carthaginian officers. Carthage retaliated by throwing captured mercenaries to elephants. Entire populations were massacred. The ancient writer Polybius, who generally had no reason to sympathize with Carthage, described it as a war surpassing all previous wars in cruelty. Hamilcar Barca was the man who ended it. Given command of the Carthaginian forces, he fought a campaign of extraordinary tactical brilliance, trapping, dividing, and eventually annihilating the mercenary army in a narrow valley called the Soar. It was a complete victory, achieved by a man who had every reason to be bitter about his own government, fighting to save the city that had abandoned him. He saved Carthage, and Carthage rewarded him with Spain. The idea was simple and ambitious. Carthage had lost Sicily and Sardinia, both island territories taken by Rome during and after the First Punic War. The Balearic Islands were still Punic, but offered limited resources. To pay the Roman indemnity, to rebuild the military, to restore Carthage's power in the Western Mediterranean, Carthage needed a new source of wealth on the same scale as what it had lost. The answer was the Iberian Peninsula, modern-day Spain and Portugal, a territory of vast mineral wealth, fine harbours, and large populations of skilled soldiers. In 237 BCE, Hamilcar Barca sailed for Spain. He took with him his son-in-law Hasdrubal and his 3 sons. The youngest of the 3 sons was 9 years old. His name was Hannibal. The story that the ancient writers preserve of Hannibal's departure is one of the most famous in all of ancient history. The boy came to his father and begged to be taken along. Hamilcar asked if he truly wanted to come, and the boy said he did. Hamilcar asked if he swore to be the enemy of Rome forever, and the boy swore on the altar of the gods, with his hand on the sacrificial flame, that he would never be a friend to Rome. The oath of Hannibal, whether it happened exactly this way or not, it captured something true about the man he would become. Hamilcar spent 9 years conquering and organizing the Iberian Peninsula. He was not simply raiding for resources, he was building an empire, a new Carthaginian territory that would be richer and more militarily productive than anything Carthage had lost. He founded cities. He organized the extraction of silver from the enormous Spanish mines. He recruited soldiers from the Iberian tribes, men who would prove to be some of the finest light infantry in the ancient world. He made alliances, fought campaigns, and slowly built what would become the foundation for the next great confrontation with Rome. He did not live to see it. In 228 BCE, Hamilcar drowned in a river battle against an Iberian tribe. He was somewhere in his mid-40s. Command passed to his son-in-law Hasdrubal, who continued the work, founding the city of Carthago Nova, New Carthage, modern-day Cartagena, as the capital of the Spanish territory. Hasdrubal was more of a diplomat than a warrior. He built alliances with local tribes, married into Iberian royalty, and expanded Carthaginian influence through politics as much as war. Rome watched all of this from across the sea and felt something it did not often feel: unease. The Ebro River Treaty of 226 BCE was Rome's attempt to contain what Carthage was building in Spain. The terms were simple. Carthage would not move north of the Ebro River with military forces. Rome would not interfere with Carthage, south of the Ebro. It was the same basic framework as the original treaties of the 5th century, an acknowledgement by both sides that they were powerful enough to require boundaries. But there was a city just south of the Ebro that had made an agreement with Rome, a city called Saguntum. It was technically within the Carthaginian sphere under the Ebro Treaty, but it had allied itself with Rome and considered itself under Roman protection. And in 221 BCE, when command in Spain passed from Hasdrubal to Hamilcar's eldest son, that city became the fault line. Everything would break along. Hannibal was 25 years old when he took command of the Carthaginian forces in Spain. He had grown up in his father's army, spent his entire adult life on campaign, and risen through the ranks as a cavalry officer and then as a battlefield commander. The soldiers adored him. He ate what they ate, slept where they slept, endured what they endured, and led from the front with a recklessness that should have gotten him killed several times, but somehow always resulted in victory instead. He was dark-haired, physically imposing, and possessed of a quality that ancient sources struggle to define precisely, but keep returning to, a kind of magnetism, an ability to project certainty even in the most uncertain situations, that made men follow him into places they would not have followed anyone else. He was also, by every account we have, deeply and implacably committed to the oath his father had made him swear. He was going to destroy Rome. The question was how, and the answer he came up with was so audacious, so logistically extraordinary, so completely outside the framework of what the Romans thought was possible, that when he actually did it, even his enemies were stunned into a kind of involuntary admiration. In 219 BCE, Hannibal laid siege to Saguntum. The city was within the Carthaginian zone under the Ebro Treaty, but it was allied with Rome. The Romans sent envoys to Hannibal, ordering him to stop. He ignored them. The Romans sent envoys to Carthage. The Carthaginian Senate, many of whose members were not enthusiastic supporters of the Barca family and their aggressive Spanish ambitions, gave vague and non-committal answers. After 8 months, Saguntum fell. Rome declared war. This was exactly what Hannibal wanted. But Hannibal had not waited for Rome to declare war before he started moving. By the time the declaration came, he was already gone. He had left his brother Hasdrubal in command of Spain with an army large enough to hold the territory, and he had taken the rest of his forces and pointed them not toward the sea, not toward the obvious route of moving against Rome by naval transport across the Mediterranean, but north, into Gaul, toward the Alps. The Romans, when they realized what he was doing, could not quite believe it. They sent an army to Spain to cut off his supply lines, and another army to intercept him at the coast. By the time their fleets arrived, Hannibal had already crossed the Pyrenees. He was heading for Italy on foot, with an army that included 37 war elephants. The crossing of the Alps by Hannibal's army in 218 BCE is one of the most famous military operations in history, and also one of the most genuinely astonishing. He took an army of roughly 50,000 soldiers, thousands of cavalry horses, and 37 elephants over the highest mountain range in Europe in late autumn, when the passes were already beginning to accumulate snow. The journey took 15 days. It cost him roughly half his army. Men fell from narrow mountain paths. They froze to death at altitude. They were ambushed by Gallic tribes who lived in the high passes and had no interest in letting this enormous army through their territory without taking a toll. But the survivors came down out of the mountains into northern Italy, and they were not defeated. They were hardened into something extraordinary. They had survived the impossible. They believed their commander was somehow more than human. And the Romans, who had been confidently expecting to fight Hannibal in Spain or North Africa, suddenly found his army in their own backyard. There is something that tends to get lost when we talk about Carthage in terms of wars and generals and the great sweeping movements of empires. The ordinary life of the city, the things that happened every day in the streets and the markets and the harbour front and the houses climbing the hill of Barca, that made Carthage not just a political entity, but a place where people actually lived. We know less about this than we would like, because so much of the evidence was destroyed. But we know some things. We know them from the archaeological layers that Roman construction did not entirely obliterate. from the comparison with other Phoenician cities of the same period, and from the occasional detail that slipped through in Greek and Roman sources that were mostly focused on wars and politics. The harbour district was the heart of the city, in the way that port districts always are. It was where the ships came in, and where commerce happened, and where the city met the wider world. Sailors arriving after long voyages across the western Mediterranean would bring news of what was happening in Sardinia, in Spain, in Sicily, in the distant ports of the Atlantic coast. The information travelled with the cargo. Amphora of wine from the Spanish coast, silver ingots from the mines at Carthago Nova, copper from Sardinia, grain from Sicily, tin from the far edge of the known world, brought down the Atlantic coast by Phoenician traders who knew the routes that other Mediterranean peoples could only guess at. The Carthaginians were protective of their trade routes in a way that reflects how much those routes were worth. Ancient sources mention Carthaginian policy of sinking the ships of any foreign traders caught in certain waters, what the Greeks called the Pillars of Hercules, the modern Strait of Gibraltar, the gateway between the Mediterranean and the open Atlantic. Whether the sinking was literal, or whether it refers to a practice of impounding ships and confiscating their cargo, is debated. But the secrecy about the Atlantic routes was real. Carthaginian knowledge of the tides and currents of the Atlantic coast, of the sources of tin and amber, of the locations of the offshore islands, was commercial intelligence of enormous value, and they kept it. A Carthaginian explorer named Hanno sailed along the West African coast somewhere around the 5th century BCE and wrote an account of his voyage. The account survives in Greek translation, which means it survived the destruction of Carthage by being copied at some point into a language Rome preserved. It describes coastal peoples, rivers, the smell of fire and cinnamon in the air from distant shores, a bay full of crocodiles, and at the end of the journey, an island populated by what the crew called wild people, covered in hair, probably gorillas, the first mention of great apes in any written record. How far south Hanno actually went is debated. Some scholars think he reached the Cameroonian coast. Some think he went further. The precision of his geographical observations suggests he went at least as far as Senegal or Guinea. Another Carthaginian explorer, named Himilco, sailed north along the Atlantic coast of Europe around the same period, reaching what was probably Britain and possibly Ireland. His account survives only in later Roman paraphrase and is harder to interpret, but it preserves descriptions of the foggy northern waters, the masses of seaweed encountered far offshore, the shallowness of certain coastal seas, and the strange creatures seen in the deep water. It sounds like the North Atlantic, experienced by a man from the warm Mediterranean, approaching it for the first time with a mixture of professional competence and genuine awe. These were not just traders, they were explorers, venturing into waters that no one in the Mediterranean world had systematic knowledge of, pushing the edges of the known world southward and northward simultaneously, bringing back observations that were remarkable enough to be remembered and copied even by people who had every reason to suppress Carthaginian achievement. The city that sent out these voyages was itself a world of considerable complexity. Within Carthage lived people who had come from many places. Phoenician families who traced their ancestry to Tyre and Sidon, Berber Libyans who had been absorbed into the city's population over centuries of contact, Numidians from the interior, Greeks who had settled in the Punic world as merchants or soldiers, Sardinians, Sicilians, Iberian Spanish, Gauls. The population of Carthage was by the height of its power a genuinely cosmopolitan mixture, which is what you would expect from the center of the greatest trading network in the Western Mediterranean. The physical evidence from cemeteries confirms this. The burial practices are not uniform. Some graves follow what appear to be Phoenician traditions, with particular arrangements of the body and particular types of grave goods. Others show different traditions, mixed and blended in ways that suggest multiple cultural backgrounds coexisting within the same city. Jewelry from the graves shows stylistic influences from Egypt, from Greece, from the Phoenician East, from Iberia, from the sub-Saharan African coast. The Carthaginians absorbed and adapted whatever they encountered, which is itself one of the defining characteristics of the Phoenician tradition they came from. Their art is harder to characterize, precisely because so little of it survives in its original context. What we have are mostly votive objects from sanctuaries, small terracotta figurines, amulets, masks, jewelry. The masks are particularly striking, grotesque, expressive, sometimes terrifying faces, often with exaggerated features, elongated chins, staring eyes, teeth bared. They appear to have served an apotropaic function, warding off evil, though exactly how they were used is not clear. They were made in large numbers and distributed widely across the Punic world. Their style is unlike anything in the Greek or Roman artistic tradition, rooted in something older and more complex. The terracotta figurines include representations of divine figures, female deities who may be Tanit or related goddesses, depicted in a variety of poses and styles that blend Phoenician iconographic traditions with Egyptian and Greek influences. There are also figurines of ordinary people, worshippers in postures of prayer, mothers with children, figures playing musical instruments. These are human-scale images, intimate in a way that the monumental art of empires rarely is. They feel like things made by and for ordinary people, not for the glorification of kings. The inscriptions that survive from the Tophet and from other sacred sites give us the names of Carthaginian people, ordinary names, following Phoenician naming conventions, devotees of Baal Hammon and Tanit, recording their offerings with the same mixture of religious obligation and personal prayer that you find in votive inscriptions from every ancient culture. "Help me. Thank you," I asked, and was heard. These are the most human things, the things that connect across the entire distance of history, because the feelings behind them are recognizable regardless of which god is being addressed or which language is being spoken. The agricultural life of Carthage is better documented than most aspects of its culture, precisely because of Mago's preserved manual. The farming techniques, described by Mago and summarized and excerpted by Roman agricultural writers, paint a picture of a sophisticated tradition developed over centuries for the specific conditions of North African soil and climate. The management of olive groves and vineyards in semi-arid conditions, the rotation of crops, the treatment of soil, the timing of planting relative to rainfall patterns, all of it reflecting a deep, accumulated understanding of how to make the land produce in difficult conditions. The vineyards of the Punic world were famous in antiquity. Wines from the Carthaginian hinterland were traded across the Mediterranean, and the amphoras in which they were shipped are found at archaeological sites throughout the ancient world. Their shape and clay composition, identifying them as products of specific Punic production regions. The olive oil similarly. The agricultural wealth of North Africa, which would later make Roman Carthage and then Byzantine North Africa some of the most productive farming regions in the ancient world, was in large part built on Punic agricultural foundations. The city of Carthage had public infrastructure of considerable sophistication. The cisterns are one of the most striking examples. Carthage sat in a region with limited rainfall and no major river. The water supply was always a strategic concern, which is why when Scipio cut the aqueduct during the final siege, it mattered so immediately. But before the aqueduct was built in the Roman period, the city relied on a network of enormous underground cisterns that collected and stored rainwater. The La Malga cisterns, which still partially survive, are a remarkable piece of engineering. A series of long parallel underground galleries that could hold enormous quantities of water for the dry months. The city's drainage and sewage systems were also more sophisticated than you might expect from a pre-Roman city. The archaeological evidence suggests careful management of wastewater in the densely populated lower city near the harbours. This matters for public health in a city of 300,000 people in the Mediterranean climate, and the Carthaginians understood it. There was a thing called the Great Council of Carthage, sometimes called the Council of Elders, which was the senior deliberative body of the Carthaginian government. It was dominated by wealthy merchant families the oligarchy that had grown rich from trade and that ran the city's affairs generation after generation. There was also a council of 104 judges who had the power to hold accountable the generals who commanded Carthage's armies, reviewing their conduct after campaigns and punishing those who were found to have failed. This institution, which ancient Greek observers noted with interest as unusual, was designed to prevent any single military leader from becoming powerful enough to threaten the civilian government. It worked, broadly speaking. Carthage never had the problem of military coup that plagued many ancient states, but it also created a dynamic where generals could be blamed for political decisions they had no control over, and where the desire to avoid punishment might influence military decisions in ways that were not always strategically sound. Hannibal Barca chafed against this system. His son Hannibal essentially circumvented it by building his own political and military base in Spain before the Second Punic War, independent enough of the Carthaginian Senate that he could launch his Italian campaign without waiting for permission he might not receive. The Carthaginian army, when Carthage actually controlled it, was one of the most diverse forces in the ancient world. Citizen soldiers of Carthage, the Sacred Band, a unit of elite Carthaginian citizens, made up a relatively small corps. Around them were allied Libyan infantry, Numidian cavalry, Iberian warriors from Spain, Balearic slingers famous throughout the ancient world for their accuracy with their weapons, Gallic warriors from southern France, Greek mercenaries, Campanian mercenaries from Italy, soldiers from every corner of the Mediterranean world that Carthaginian money could reach. The management of this diversity was itself a skill, keeping men who spoke different languages and followed different gods and had different fighting traditions organized into a coherent army. The Barca family were masters at it. Other Carthaginian commanders were sometimes less successful. The Numidian cavalry deserves particular attention because it was so central to Carthaginian military success. The Numidians were the people of what is now northern Algeria, a pastoralist culture organized around horses in the way that other pastoralist cultures are organized around cattle. They rode without saddles and often without bridles, controlling their horses with their knees and a simple rope around the animal's neck. The technique, which struck other ancient peoples as almost magical, allowed Numidian riders to use both hands for fighting while moving at full speed. They were employed as scouts, as screening forces, as pursuit cavalry, as shock troops when needed. In every Carthaginian army from Hamilcar's time through Hannibal's, they were indispensable. It was losing the Numidian cavalry, specifically Massinissa's decision to ally with Rome and bring his people's riders to the Roman side. That changed the military balance of the Second Punic War more than any other single factor. At Cannae, Hannibal's Numidians were the decisive element. At Zama, Scipio's Numidians were. The technology, in this case the horsemanship, was the same. What changed was whose side it was on. The elephants are one of the most striking details of Carthaginian military history, and also one of the most visually arresting. The Carthaginians used African forest elephants, a subspecies that is now extinct, smaller than the African bush elephant, and apparently more trainable. They carried towers on their backs containing soldiers who could fight from the height advantage, and they were used primarily as shock weapons, sent into enemy formations to break them up and cause panic. The problem was that elephants, while terrifying when they worked, were also terrifying when they did not. A frightened elephant running in the wrong direction was one of the most dangerous things on a battlefield. Carthaginian commanders, aware of this, equipped their elephant drivers with a spike and hammer for use in emergencies, to be driven into the elephant's skull if it turned on its own army. Whether this was actually done in practice is unclear from the sources, but the precaution was apparently considered necessary. Hannibal's 37 elephants crossed the Alps and arrived in Italy in various states of health after the ordeal of the mountain crossing. Most of them died during the first winter in the Po Valley. One survivor, apparently the last one left alive in the spring of 217 BCE, was a large animal named Surus, Syrian, suggesting he may have been a Syrian elephant rather than a North African one, and Hannibal apparently used him personally as a mount for part of the Italian campaign. One elephant out of 37, surviving the Alps and the Italian winter, and going on to carry the general who had brought him there. There is something quietly remarkable about that. The life of Hannibal's army in Italy during the 15 years of the campaign has left some traces in the historical record. Ancient sources describe the soldiers becoming hardened to the Italian climate, learning to live off the land, developing relationships with the local populations in the territories where they were based. In the south of Italy particularly, Bruttium, the toe of the Italian boot, was where Hannibal maintained his last base of operations for the final years in Italy. The local Bruttian people had allied with him and remained loyal even as the rest of the south gradually drifted back toward Rome. What was it like to be a soldier in Hannibal's army during those years? To have crossed the Alps and fought Trebia and Trasimene and Cannae and won them all, and then to be slowly confined to a smaller and smaller piece of southern Italy while the war went wrong elsewhere. The veterans who had survived every battle, who had been with Hannibal from Spain through the Alps and across Italy, watching their general's extraordinary talent deployed again and again in tactical brilliance that could win any battle but could not win the war. There must have been a particular quality to that experience, a loyalty to the man that was separate from confidence in the outcome, because these soldiers had seen what he could do, and they stayed. Ancient sources mention that Hannibal's army in Italy maintained remarkable discipline throughout the 15 years of the campaign, which is extraordinary for a mercenary force far from home and supply. There was apparently limited desertion, limited internal conflict, the kind of cohesion that is very difficult to sustain across any extended period, and that reflects both the quality of the commander and the quality of the army he had built. These soldiers were professionals in the fullest sense of the word. Many of them had been fighting since their young adulthood. The veterans of the Italian campaign were men shaped by those years into something more than soldiers, survivors of an experience unlike anything in the ancient world. When Hannibal was finally recalled to Africa in 203 BCE, he reportedly wept. Not, the ancient sources suggest, from weakness, but from the weight of understanding what the recall meant. He had held Italy undefeated for 15 years and had accomplished nothing decisive. Rome had not broken, the strategy had failed. He was going home to fight a battle that, for the first time in his life, he suspected he might lose. At Zama, he tried everything he knew. The ancient account of the battle in Polybius is detailed enough that military historians have been analysing it ever since. He tried to disrupt the Roman formation with the elephants, but Scipio's countermeasure worked. He tried to use his cavalry to pin the Roman flanks, but Massinissa's superior numbers overwhelmed them. He tried to draw the battle to a conclusion with his veteran infantry before Massinissa's cavalry could return from pursuit, but the Romans held long enough. When Massinissa came back, the shape of the battle changed in a moment. Even in defeat, Hannibal's tactical instincts were evident. The speed with which he recognized the battle was lost and extracted himself from the collapsing army, saving his own life for the political fight that followed, was characteristic. He did not die at Zama, which was not inevitable. Many of his commanders did. The political career that followed the military one is often overlooked in accounts of Hannibal's life, but it is revealing. A man who had spent his entire adult life at war found himself, at 50, reorganizing a city's finances and confronting the endemic corruption of an oligarchic system that had never fully supported his war to begin with. He was apparently very good at it. The financial reforms he instituted as Suffet of Carthage were credited by ancient sources with significantly improving the city's ability to manage its reparations, payments, which is a boring but real achievement that demonstrates the breadth of his abilities. The faction of Carthaginian oligarchs who opposed him, who had been among those most skeptical of the Barca family's aggressive foreign policy from the beginning, eventually forced him into exile by accusing him before Rome of treasonous correspondence with foreign kings. Whether the charge was true, whether Hannibal was actually planning another military adventure, is unclear. The circumstantial evidence suggests he was indeed in contact with Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire, who was developing his own conflict with Rome, but the specific charges brought against him in Carthage were brought by his domestic enemies as much as in response to real Roman concerns. When he fled Carthage for the east, he was approximately 53 years old. He had been away from North Africa for most of his life, in Spain, and then in Italy, and now in exile. He offered his military expertise to Antiochus against Rome in the war that was developing in the east, and Antiochus accepted his services, but largely ignored his advice. Hannibal reportedly recommended a bold Western strategy, landing forces in Italy and making contact with whatever pro-Carthaginian sentiment remained there, fighting Rome in its own territory the way he had done. Antiochus preferred to fight in Greece and the eastern Mediterranean, where Rome had less direct experience. The advice that was ignored, the strategy that was never tried, is one of those historical might-have-beens that invites speculation. Antiochus was defeated. The years that followed were restless and diminishing. The Seleucid court, then the court of Prusias in Bithynia, always one step ahead of Roman diplomatic pressure, always being moved along by the uncomfortable fact of his existence, which Rome found impossible to entirely ignore. He was too famous, too potentially dangerous, too useful as a rallying point for any future anti-Roman power to be allowed to simply live quietly. He commanded a Bithynian fleet against Eumenes of Pergamon, a Roman ally, and won a naval battle by the unusual method of having his sailors throw pots containing venomous snakes onto the decks of the enemy ships. That detail, preserved in the ancient sources as a somewhat bemused aside, captures something of the man's creativity and his refusal to accept that any problem was insoluble. Even at the end of his life, commanding a tiny fleet for a minor king, he was still finding novel solutions. When the end came, it came quickly. Roman emissaries arrived at the court of Prusias with demands for Hannibal's surrender or expulsion. Prusias, who had not the military strength to defy Rome and not the personal loyalty to protect a man who had served him well, agreed to hand Hannibal over. Whether Prusias actually warned Hannibal that he was about to be betrayed, or whether Hannibal's own intelligence network told him, the ancient sources vary. But Hannibal knew in time to choose his own ending. He sent word to his freedmen to check all the exits of the house. There was no way out. Every exit was guarded. He said, "Let us put an end to the great anxiety of the Romans, who have thought it too lengthy and too heavy a task to wait for the death of a hated old man." He reached for the poison he kept in the ring. He was somewhere between 60 and 65 years old. He had spent 40 years at war. He had never been defeated in the field by a Roman army. He had come closer to destroying Rome than any enemy before or after, and he died alone in a borrowed house in a foreign country, taking his own life to prevent the Romans from taking him in chains. What Rome did with his memory afterward is instructive. It could not erase him because his military record was too extraordinary and too well documented. Instead, it shaped him. Roman authors like Livy, writing a generation or two later, described Hannibal with grudging admiration for his military genius, while cataloguing his vices with great thoroughness. Cruelty, faithlessness, impiety, excessive ambition. The virtues were real, but the man was fundamentally bad. In the Roman telling, a brilliant enemy, therefore a worthy one to have defeated. The Romans needed Hannibal to be great because it made their victory greater, but they also needed him to be flawed because it justified their treatment of Carthage. That tension runs through all of Roman writing about Carthage. The need to simultaneously justify the destruction and acknowledge the greatness of what was destroyed. Polybius, who was the most intellectually honest of the ancient historians, and who actually visited Carthage shortly before its end and served in the Roman army during the Third Punic War, wrote about the fall of Carthage with evident ambivalence. He understood, as a Greek intellectual and a careful historian, that great civilizations fall in ways that should disturb anyone who thinks about it clearly. That Rome's victory over Carthage was not the triumph of virtue over vice, but the outcome of military and political competition between two sophisticated powers, one of which happened to be more adaptable and more stubbornly unwilling to accept defeat. The Stoic philosopher and teacher Panaetius, who was also present in Scipio's circle in the years of the Third Punic War, is reported to have engaged in conversations with Scipio about the nature of empire and the responsibility of power. These conversations are mostly lost, preserved only in fragments and references, but there is something haunting in the image of the man who destroyed Carthage spending his evenings discussing philosophy with a teacher who was trying to think through what it meant to use power well. Scipio was not a simple man. He was someone who could cite Homer over a burning city and mean it. The Rome that emerged from the Punic Wars was a different Rome from the one that had entered them. The encounters with Carthage changed Roman military organization, Roman strategy, Roman political culture, Roman sense of its own mission in the world. The wars also created the enormous wealth that flowed into Rome through the spoils of Carthage and the economic integration of the Western Mediterranean under Roman commercial hegemony. And they created the enormous inequality that would destabilize the Roman Republic in the century after Carthage's fall. As the wealth concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, and the dispossessed soldiers who had won the wars came home to find that their land had been absorbed into the great estates of the wealthy while they were away fighting. The Gracchi brothers, who tried in the decade after the destruction of Carthage to address this inequality through land reform and were both murdered for it, are in a complicated sense victims of the same process that destroyed Carthage. The wealth that came from that destruction, the land that came available, the disruption of the small farmer class that formed the backbone of the Roman army, all of it fed into the crisis of the late Republic that eventually produced Julius Caesar and Augustus, and the transformation of the Republic into the Empire. The shadow of Carthage is longer than it looks. There is a question that no one can fully answer, but that seems important to try to hold. What would the world look like if Carthage had won? Not Hannibal's specific campaign, not the Second Punic War, but the longer version of the question. What if the competition between Carthage and Rome had ended differently at any of several points? What if Carthage had not been destroyed in 146 BCE, but had continued as an independent power? The counterfactual history of Rome not becoming the dominant power of the Mediterranean is almost impossible to construct, because Rome's dominance shaped so much of what came after. The legal and political traditions, the linguistic inheritance, the religious transformation that produced Christianity in a specific Roman imperial context, the roads and the administrative structures that shaped the geography of Europe and North Africa for centuries. All of it traces back to Rome's particular victory. A Mediterranean world where Carthage survived as a major commercial power, where Punic culture and language continued alongside Greek and Roman influences, where the North African coast remained a center of independent Semitic civilization rather than becoming a Roman province, would have been a genuinely different world. The details of how different are impossible to specify, but the fact of the difference is hard to deny. What we lost with Carthage is not just a city, we lost a possible future, a road not taken, a whole way of organizing the relationship between people and the sea and commerce and the divine that had been developing for 7 centuries and was cut off before it reached wherever it was going. That is an immense thing to lose. Even if we cannot name exactly what we lost, even if we can only gesture at the absence where something should be. The light over the Bay of Tunis in the early morning, before the city wakes, is very specific. It comes off the water with a quality that belongs to this particular angle of sea and sky, this particular latitude, this particular time of year. The olive trees on the hills catch it one way, the water catches it another. There is a quality of stillness before the wind picks up that the Carthaginians who worked the harbour at this hour would have recognized, because it has not changed. The light has been the same, the water has been the same, the smell of salt and morning and the hint of something green from the hills. The harbour is different now, silted, built over. The modern city of Tunis occupies the same ground, but is organised differently, speaks different languages, addresses different gods, remembers different histories. But the shape of the bay is still there. The peninsula is still there. The hill is still there. And somewhere in the hill and in the sediment at the bottom of the bay, and in the handful of inscriptions that scholars are still patiently working to understand, Carthage persists. Not as ruins, exactly, more as a resonance, a frequency that you can almost pick up if you are very quiet and paying careful attention. History has a way of making the distant past feel inevitable, as if what happened had to happen, as if the outcome was written before the story began. But nothing was inevitable. Elissa chose to go west. The Mamertines sent appeals to both Rome and Carthage. Hannibal chose the Alps. Massinissa chose Rome. Cato chose to end every speech with those 5 words. The Roman Senate chose to make demands they knew no city could accept. Each of these choices was made by a person in a specific moment, with specific pressures and specific information and specific fears and hopes. The outcome of all those choices, accumulated over centuries, was the world we have. A world with Rome's legacy embedded in it at a depth that shapes how we think, even about things that seem entirely modern. A world without Carthage's continuation, without whatever that continuation would have produced. There are 7 million people who self-identify as Maya today, the descendants of the people whose cities we were thinking about earlier this year. The descendants of Carthage are harder to locate because the city was destroyed more thoroughly and the culture was more completely suppressed. But the Tunisian people, the Berbers and Arabs, and the mixed Mediterranean population of North Africa live on the land where Carthage was. The Semitic linguistic family that Punic belonged to continues in Hebrew and Arabic and Aramaic. The gods of Carthage, Baal, Hammon, and Tanit, are gone as active religious presences, but the places where they were worshipped are still in the ground. There is a continuity there, even if it is harder to trace. The land remembers in ways that people may not be fully aware of. The farming techniques developed over Punic centuries are embedded in North African agricultural practice in ways that may never be fully untangled from later contributions. The harbour sites that Carthaginians chose for their ability to shelter ships from the particular winds and currents of the Western Mediterranean are still harbour sites, because the winds and the currents have not changed. The fishermen who work the Bay of Tunis today use boats and methods that are several generations removed from anything Punic. But they work the same water, reading the same weather. The water does not forget who has sailed on it. It carries no memory in any physical sense. And yet there is a continuity of place that means something, even if the meaning is more poetic than empirical. Carthage chose this bay because it was good. The bay is still there, still good. People still live on it and sail from it and return to it. That is, in its way, a kind of survival. Not the survival that Elissa wanted, perhaps. Not the survival that Hannibal fought for, but a persistence of place and of the human instinct to build and live, and trade and pray, and argue and love, that is larger than any single civilization, however great, larger even than Rome, larger than the categories we use to organize history. People lived here. For 700 years, people lived here and built things, and believed things, and loved their children, and buried their dead, and sailed away, and came back and prayed for rain. Whatever else Carthage was, it was that. And that is enough to be remembered with something more than the contempt of conquerors. Something more like what is owed to any human story, honestly told. Something like respect. Something like grief for what was lost. Something like the quiet that comes at the end of a long story, when you have followed it all the way to the silence where it stops, and you sit with it for a moment before sleep. What followed in the next few years was the most spectacular sequence of military victories the ancient world had ever seen, and also the most profound strategic failure. The Roman army that came north to meet Hannibal was under the command of the consul Publius Cornelius Scipio. He met the Carthaginian cavalry at the Ticinus River and was almost killed. The Romans fell back. Hannibal crossed the Po River. A second Roman army, under the consul Sempronius Longus, met Hannibal at the Trebia River in December of 218 BCE. Hannibal lured the Romans across the freezing water at dawn, before they had eaten breakfast, and then had his cavalry hit them from behind, while his brother Mago's troops emerged from where they had been hidden overnight in a streambed. The Romans lost 20 to 25,000 men. The Carthaginians had crossed the Alps and destroyed 2 Roman armies in their first 4 months in Italy. News of the disaster spread through Italy with a speed that the Romans had not felt since the Gauls had sacked their city 2 centuries earlier. The road to Rome was open. The Romans sent a third army north, under the consul Gaius Flaminius. Hannibal did not go directly toward Rome. He understood something about warfare that many generals of his era did not. That armies are not destroyed by marching toward them. They are destroyed by maneuver, by forcing them to fight on ground of your choosing at a time of your choosing against a disposition they did not anticipate. He marched south through Etruria, bypassing Roman positions, letting it be known through his treatment of the Italian countryside exactly where he was going, and daring the Romans to catch him. Flaminius followed, exactly as Hannibal expected. In the spring of 217 BCE, Hannibal selected a piece of ground on the northern shore of Lake Trasimene in central Etruria, and he turned everything that ground offered into a trap. The road ran along the lake's edge through a narrow defile, with hills rising steeply on one side and water on the other. Hannibal arranged his heavy infantry at the far end of the defile, visible from the road. He hid his Gauls and cavalry in the hills on either side, concealed in the morning mist that rose off the lake. When Flaminius marched his army into the defile, the trap closed. Hannibal's hidden troops poured down from the hills into the flanks and rear of the Roman column. The battle lasted less than 3 hours. 15,000 Romans died, including Flaminius himself. Another 10,000 were captured. Hannibal lost 1,500 men. 3 major Roman armies destroyed in less than a year. Rome had never experienced anything like this. The panic in the city was total. The Romans appointed a dictator, an emergency magistrate given absolute power in times of crisis, a man named Quintus Fabius Maximus, and Fabius immediately recognized something that the previous commanders had not. You could not beat Hannibal in open battle. Hannibal was simply better at open battle than anyone Rome had. He chose the ground, he chose the moment, he used his mixed forces, the Numidian cavalry on the flanks, the heavy infantry at the center, the skirmishers and elephants to disrupt, with a mastery that Roman commanders could not match. Fabius decided not to fight. He would shadow Hannibal's army, harry its foraging parties, cut off small detachments, deny it battle while bleeding it slowly. The strategy worked in principle, but was politically catastrophic. The Romans called Fabius the delayer, and they did not mean it as a compliment, they meant it as an insult. Rome had never run from a fight in living memory. The idea of following a Carthaginian army around Italy, watching it burn Roman allies' farms and towns, without striking back, felt like cowardice. It felt like defeat, even in the absence of battle. When Fabius's term as dictator ended, the Romans elected 2 new consuls, Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus, and gave them the largest army Rome had ever assembled. 8 legions, plus allied troops, somewhere between 70,000 and 86,000 soldiers. They marched south to find Hannibal. Hannibal was near the town of Cannae in Apulia, in the heel of the Italian boot. He had been there for some time, resting his men and gathering supplies from the surrounding agricultural plain. He could see the Roman army coming. He chose his ground with his usual care, positioning his forces on flat, open terrain that gave his cavalry room to operate. On the morning of August 2, 216 BCE, 2 of the greatest armies in the ancient world faced each other across a dusty field. What happened next has been studied by military historians for 2,000 years. It is taught in military academies today. It has been called the most perfectly executed battle in history. Hannibal placed his weakest troops, his Gauls and Spanish infantry, in a bulging convex line at the center. His best African infantry, trained and equipped now in Roman armor captured from the previous battles, he placed at the ends of the line, bent back like wings. His Numidian cavalry went on one flank, and his heavier Spanish and Gallic cavalry on the other. The Romans, confident in their numbers, drove straight at the Carthaginian center. The Gauls and Spanish, under enormous pressure, began to give ground. The convex line slowly bent inward, the center retreating under the Roman assault. The Romans pushed harder. The Gauls retreated further. The Romans packed in tighter, shoulder to shoulder, trying to break through. The line kept bending until it bent all the way into a concave pocket, and the Roman army found itself almost completely surrounded. Hannibal's African infantry, on the wings, wheeled inward. The Carthaginian cavalry, having routed the Roman cavalry on both flanks, swung around the Roman rear. The Romans were hemmed in on all four sides by enemies, packed so tightly together that the men in the center could barely lift their arms to fight. 70,000 Romans died at Cannae, among them the consul Aemilius Paulus, 80 senators, and 21 military tribunes. It was the worst single day in Roman military history, before or after. Hannibal, the commander of the Numidian cavalry, came to Hannibal after the battle and is reported to have said, famously, "Give me 5 days. Let me lead the cavalry to Rome, and you can dine in the capital." Hannibal refused. He said he needed time to consider the situation. Hannibal's response has been remembered for millennia. He looked at his commander and said, "You know how to gain a victory, Hannibal, but you do not know how to use one." What Hannibal was waiting for, what his entire strategy had been built on, was defection. He had not come to Italy to destroy Rome through sheer military force. He understood that Rome itself was too large, too well fortified, too deep within its own alliance system to be taken by storm. What he wanted to do was break that alliance system. The Latin and Italian cities that formed the backbone of Rome's military manpower were bound to Rome by treaty. But those treaties were relationships of varying degrees of loyalty and resentment. If enough of Rome's Italian allies defected to Hannibal after a series of catastrophic defeats, Rome would be left isolated, stripped of its reservoir of soldiers, and forced to come to terms. After Cannae, defections did come. The powerful city of Capua in Campania went over to Hannibal. Several other southern Italian cities followed. Philip V of Macedon concluded an alliance with Carthage. A revolt in Sardinia seemed possible. Syracuse in Sicily, under a new king, began to lean toward Carthage. But the mass defection Hannibal needed never happened. The Roman system of alliances was stronger than he had calculated, reinforced by centuries of shared language, legal status, and the practical reality that Rome had never been as harsh a master as it might have been. And Rome itself, against all reasonable expectation, did not break. What the Romans did instead was reach inside themselves and find something that their enemies consistently underestimated: stubbornness. The absolute refusal to accept defeat as final. The Roman Senate met in emergency session after Cannae and did not discuss terms. They stripped the treasury to raise new armies. They sent out commissioners to press into service every able-bodied man available, including freeing and arming slaves. They sent a delegation to Delphi to ask the oracle what they should do, and while they waited for the answer, they buried alive 2 Gauls and 2 Greeks in the Roman Forum, a human sacrifice of a kind Rome almost never performed, an act of desperate religious bargaining with the gods. And they went back to the strategy of Fabius: shadow Hannibal, deny him battle, keep his army from breaking out of the south of Italy, starve him of replacements and supplies. Rome held on. Hannibal spent the next 12 years in Italy. He never lost a major engagement. He wandered the peninsula at will, fighting skirmishes, taking towns, trying to break Roman resolve. He marched to within a few miles of Rome itself, close enough that his cavalry rode up to the city's gates, and the Romans could see the dust of his horses from the walls. The incident produced a saying that would echo through Roman history: Hannibal ante portas. Hannibal is at the gates, a phrase used for centuries afterward as shorthand for existential threat. But he never attacked the city. He did not have the siege equipment to breach its walls. He did not have the manpower to sustain a siege, while simultaneously holding his position in the field against Roman armies that kept regenerating. He was trapped in Italy, brilliant and undefeated, and utterly unable to finish the war he had started. And while he was in Italy, the war was going wrong for Carthage everywhere else. In Spain, a new Roman commander arrived in 211 BCE. He was 25 years old. His father and uncle had both been killed fighting Carthaginian forces in Spain. He had watched his father nearly die at the Ticinus and had personally pulled him out of danger, one of the stories Romans would tell about him for generations. His name was Publius Cornelius Scipio. He would be called Africanus. He was going to be the man who ended everything. Scipio in Spain was startlingly, almost frighteningly, good. He was not just tactically brilliant, though he was that. He was a strategist on a level that Rome had not produced before. He understood that defeating Hannibal's forces in Spain was not enough. He needed to take the source of Carthaginian power in Spain away, the city of Carthago Nova, which sat on a peninsula accessible only by a narrow causeway, and which held the silver treasury that funded the entire Spanish operation, enormous stores of supplies, and hundreds of hostages from Iberian tribes who had been brought there as security for their tribe's loyalty to Carthage. In 209 BCE, Scipio attacked Carthago Nova. He had noticed, through his own reconnaissance, that the lagoon on the north side of the city dropped to wading depth at low tide. He led his main assault against the walls from the causeway to fix the defenders in place, and then sent a detachment of 500 soldiers to wade through the lagoon at low tide. They went over the undefended northern wall, while the entire garrison was occupied at the causeway. The city fell in a single afternoon. Scipio released all the Iberian hostages without ransom. He was making a political statement as much as a military one. The Iberian tribes had been loyal to Carthage out of fear and self-interest. He was offering a better deal. Tribe after tribe shifted its allegiance. By 207 BCE, Hasdrubal, Hannibal's brother who had been holding Spain, led his own army over the Alps into Italy, trying to reinforce his brother. The two Barca brothers might together have had enough force to change the situation. But Hasdrubal's army was intercepted at the Metaurus River and destroyed. Roman troops who had been shadowing Hasdrubal cut off a messenger he had sent to Hannibal to arrange a meeting. Hannibal was in his camp in the south of Italy when a Roman soldier rode up to the perimeter and threw something over the wall. It was his brother's head. Hannibal looked at it and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "I recognize the fate of Carthage." He knew the war was lost. He could not be defeated. He could not win. He was a military genius, trapped in an impossible situation, brilliant and dangerous, and completely unable to change what was coming. He remained in Italy for 4 more years, undefeated in the field, methodically retreating to a position in the very toe of the peninsula, holding on. In 204 BCE, Scipio landed in North Africa. Scipio had spent months preparing for the African campaign. He had established a base in Sicily, trained his army to an extraordinary degree, and spent considerable diplomatic energy cultivating a relationship with a Numidian prince named Massinissa, who controlled the finest cavalry in the western Mediterranean. The Numidians were the horsemen of the North African coast, riders of incomparable skill who had long served in Carthaginian armies. Massinissa had his own grievances against Carthage and his own ambitions for the Numidian kingdom. Scipio offered him an alliance, and Massinissa accepted. When Scipio landed on the African coast, Carthage panicked in a way it had not done since the Mercenary War. The war had been in Italy, at a distance that felt manageable. Now it was outside the city walls. The Carthaginian Senate did 2 things simultaneously. It recalled Hannibal from Italy, and it sent envoys to Scipio to negotiate peace. The peace negotiations were another calculated move in a long game. Carthage needed time for Hannibal to arrive. Scipio, who understood this perfectly, offered terms that were harsh but not ruinous. Carthage would surrender Spain and the islands. It would pay a substantial indemnity. It would hand over its fleet and most of its war elephants, but it would survive. It would remain an independent city with its own government and its own trade. The Carthaginian Senate agreed. And then, apparently at the influence of the faction around Hannibal's allies, they repudiated the agreement. Carthaginian forces attacked a Roman supply convoy. Scipio, who had been genuinely willing to end the war on these terms, understood that the negotiation was a trick. He struck his camp and marched inland. Hannibal arrived in North Africa in the spring of 202 BCE. He had left Italy with an army that had never been defeated on an Italian battlefield. He still commanded the finest soldiers in the ancient world, veterans who had spent 15 years campaigning together, survivors of the Alps and of Trebia and Trasimene and Cannae. He moved quickly to rally additional forces, recruiting Numidians who were not loyal to Massinissa and gathering Carthaginian citizen soldiers and whatever mercenaries he could find. The two armies met at Zama in October of 202 BCE. Before the battle, Hannibal requested a meeting with Scipio. The two men rode out between the armies with interpreters and faced each other for the only time in their lives. By ancient standards, this was an extraordinary moment. The greatest Roman general of his generation and the greatest general in the world, face to face on a dusty North African plain, each knowing that the fate of everything hung on what was about to happen. What was said is recorded in various ancient sources and probably represents the broad outline of the actual conversation, even if the exact words are reconstructed. Hannibal reportedly told Scipio that he came as a man who had known victory and defeat, and that fortune was unstable, and that the wise man accepted a good peace rather than risked everything on the outcome of battle. He reportedly offered to accept terms that would leave Carthage with essentially what it had before the war in Spain began. Just North Africa, just the city and its immediate territory. Scipio reportedly said that Carthage had had the chance for a good peace and had repudiated it, that the terms being offered were no longer available, and that if Hannibal believed fortune was unstable, he should put his faith in something more reliable than its favor. They returned to their armies. The Battle of Zama was different from every battle Hannibal had fought before, for one fundamental reason: he did not have the cavalry. Massinissa's Numidians gave Scipio an overwhelming advantage in horsemen, and every battle Hannibal had won had been won by cavalry. At Trebia and Trasimene and Cannae, his Numidian and Spanish horsemen had crushed the Roman cavalry and then swung around to strike the enemy in the rear. That was the mechanism of every great victory. Without it, the battle reduced to two bodies of heavy infantry pushing against each other, and in that confrontation, with his veteran African infantry exhausted by years of campaigning and his new recruits undertrained, Hannibal did not have a clear advantage. He tried everything. He sent his war elephants forward to open the battle, 80 of them, the largest elephant force he had ever commanded. Scipio had trained his soldiers for exactly this. The Roman cohorts opened gaps in their lines, and the elephants charged through them, redirected by noise and javelins, onto the Carthaginian cavalry on the flanks. The elephant attack, meant to break the Roman formation, instead disrupted Hannibal's own cavalry. Massinissa pursued the Carthaginian horse off the field. The infantry then came together in the greatest collision of the ancient world, the Romans against Hannibal's men. For a time, it was close. Hannibal's veterans were everything they had always been. The battle was balanced on a knife edge, and then Massinissa came back. The Numidian cavalry, having destroyed the Carthaginian horsemen, returned to the battlefield and struck the Carthaginian infantry from the rear. It was Cannae in reverse. Hannibal's men were surrounded. The army that had never been beaten was broken. 20,000 Carthaginians died. 20,000 more were captured. Hannibal escaped with a handful of cavalry and rode to Hadrumetum. It was the only battle of his career that he lost. Carthage sued for peace. The terms Scipio offered were the harshest yet. Carthage surrendered all its warships except 10. It surrendered all its war elephants and agreed never to train more. It agreed to pay enormous reparations over 50 years, a sum so large it would dominate Carthaginian finances for the next generation. Most critically, Carthage agreed that it would not make war on anyone without Roman permission. It was not a treaty between equals. It was the surrender of an independent power to a dominant one. But Carthage survived. It remained a city. Its population continued, its trade continued, its culture continued, and Hannibal remained. For several years after Zama, he actually served as one of Carthage's chief magistrates, a suffet, and he did it with the same focused intelligence he had brought to war. He reformed the finances, rooted out corruption in the collection of tribute from the Libyan hinterland, and managed to reduce the period of the Roman reparations by demonstrating that Carthage could actually pay it off faster than scheduled. Rome was not comfortable with Hannibal alive and politically active. Under pressure from Rome and facing charges brought against him by political enemies within Carthage itself, Hannibal fled the city in 195 BCE. He went east to the court of the Seleucid king Antiochus III and later to other Eastern powers, always offering his military expertise, always being hunted by Roman diplomatic pressure. He served as an admiral against Rome's allies. He won some battles and lost others. He was never again at the center of events. In 183 BCE, with Roman agents closing in around him at the court of King Prusius in Bithynia, Hannibal took poison he kept hidden in a ring he wore for exactly this purpose. He was about 64 years old. His last reported words, as recorded by the ancient sources, were, "Let us now put an end to the great anxiety of the Romans, who have thought it too lengthy and too heavy a task to wait for the death of a hated old man." He died in a room in a foreign country, the last enemy Rome had truly feared, alone. The same year, Scipio Africanus died in voluntary exile at his country estate outside Rome. He had faced political attacks by his enemies in Rome, prosecution and humiliation by men who had never won a battle in their lives, and resented the man who had won the greatest war in Roman history. He left instructions that he should not be buried in the city that had refused to give him peace. Two great men, destroyed by the smallness of the world around them, dying in the same year, on opposite sides of the sea. There is something in that coincidence that the ancient writers noticed and that still carries weight. Carthage, without Hannibal, entered a period of genuine recovery. Stripped of military power, it turned entirely to commerce, and it was extraordinarily good at commerce. The agricultural development of its North African territory, the rich farmland of what is now Tunisia, became remarkably productive. Carthaginian writers on agronomy were considered the finest in the ancient world. A Carthaginian named Mago wrote a 28-volume work on farming that the Romans valued so highly that after the final destruction of Carthage, they translated it into Latin and had it preserved. The rest of Carthage's library was burned. By the middle of the 2nd century BCE, Carthage had recovered economically to a degree that made some Romans deeply uncomfortable. The city was rich again. Its population was growing. It was paying off its war indemnity on schedule. It was not, under any reasonable reading of the situation, a military threat. It had no fleet worth mentioning. It had no army capable of offensive operations. It had agreed contractually to never make war without Roman permission, but it was prosperous, and prosperous Carthage made certain Romans nervous in a way that had nothing to do with military reality and everything to do with the psychology of power. There was a Roman senator named Marcus Porcius Cato. He was old, severe, moralistic, and absolutely convinced that Carthage had to die. He had visited the city on a diplomatic mission around 153 BCE and was reportedly stunned by how recovered it looked, how full of life, how wealthy, how young and growing. He returned to Rome and began ending every speech he gave in the Senate, on any topic whatsoever, with the same 5 words: Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. Not because Carthage had violated the peace treaty, not because it was building armies, not because there was any genuine military threat, but because Cato and the faction he represented had decided that Carthage simply existing was dangerous. That a wealthy, commercially powerful Carthage, even a demilitarized one, would always potentially become a threat again, and that the only way to be certain Rome was safe was to make Carthage cease to exist entirely. The Third Punic War began in 149 BCE. It began with a diplomatic trap so cynically constructed that even some Roman writers of the period were visibly uncomfortable describing it. The immediate pretext was a dispute between Carthage and Massinissa, who was now the aged king of Numidia and a close Roman ally. Massinissa had spent decades gradually encroaching on Carthaginian territory, taking chunks of farming land that had long been Carthaginian, and the Romans had consistently ruled in his favor whenever Carthage complained. Finally, in 150 BCE, Carthage fought back, sending an army to stop Massinissa's incursions. The army was defeated, which was almost beside the point. Carthage had made war without Roman permission. That was a treaty violation. That was the pretext Rome had been waiting for. Rome sent an embassy to Carthage with a demand so extraordinary that it is difficult to understand even now how any government was expected to accept it. The Carthaginians were told to hand over 300 hostages from the city's leading families as a demonstration of good faith and to await further instructions. The hostages were handed over, the children of senators and generals transported to Rome. Then the Roman commissioners told Carthage what the further instructions were. Carthage must surrender all its weapons and war equipment, all of it. Every sword, every spear, every catapult, every piece of armor. The city of Carthage itself would be allowed to continue, but it must be rebuilt at least 15 kilometers from the sea. Carthage without its harbor was not Carthage, it was nothing. A city on the coast that could not touch the water was not a city at all. It was a slow death. The Carthaginians argued, pleaded, pointed out that they had complied with every demand and had received only worse demands in return. The Roman commissioners were unmoved. The decision had already been made. The commissioners returned to their ships. When the news of what Rome had demanded reached the Carthaginian people, what happened next was immediate and total. The city erupted. Mobs in the street tore apart the men who had counseled submission. The gates of the city were locked. Weapons were gathered from wherever they could be found. Citizens who had no weapons made them from whatever materials were available. Ancient sources describe the entire population working around the clock, men and women, free and enslaved, manufacturing catapults and arrows and swords in every building large enough to be used as a workshop. Women cut off their long hair to be twisted into ropes for the catapult machines, because the proper bowstring material was unavailable. The city prepared for a siege. It knew it probably could not survive. The first Roman army sent to reduce Carthage was commanded by incompetent generals who accomplished almost nothing. The city's walls held. The army milled about outside them, suffering from disease and supply problems and the kind of disorganized leadership that made the previous year's confident declarations of victory look foolish. This went on for 2 years. Then Rome sent a new commander. His name was Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus. He was the adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus, and he was 37 years old when he arrived in Africa, having been elected consul in a special election despite being below the legal minimum age for the office, because Rome needed someone who could actually fight. Scipio Aemilianus looked at the mess his predecessors had made and imposed order with the same unsentimental efficiency that his adoptive grandfather had brought to Spain 60 years earlier. He restored discipline to the Roman army. He cut off the supply routes to Carthage by building a massive mole, an artificial causeway, across the mouth of the harbour so nothing could enter or leave by sea. He reorganized the siege works and began methodically tightening the ring around the city. Inside Carthage, the situation grew desperate. The population, estimated at somewhere between 300 and 500,000 people, was sealed inside a city that could receive no food and no reinforcements. What had already been difficult became, over months, catastrophic. People starved. Disease spread through the crowded streets. The garrison commander, a man named Hasdrubal, maintained order through a combination of genuine leadership and brutal violence against anyone who suggested surrender. In the spring of 146 BCE, Scipio launched his final assault. The Romans broke through the harbour district and into the city itself, and then began what turned into 6 days of street-by-street combat through the lower city. The ancient sources describe the fighting with extraordinary detail, because the Roman officer assigned to write the campaign's history was a Greek historian named Polybius, who was present, watching from Scipio's side. He describes the houses falling one after another as the Romans pushed through them, soldiers fighting through the rubble, people on rooftops throwing whatever they could find onto the soldiers below, the fire spreading through the densely packed wooden upper stories of the multi-level buildings. The Romans worked their way up the hill of Bursa, the citadel, the place where Alyssa had first laid down her ox hide and said, "This much, at least, is mine." In the end, Hasdrubal's wife is one of the things that survives the silence of all the lost Carthaginian sources. When Hasdrubal surrendered, coming out of the citadel to prostrate himself before Scipio and beg for mercy, his wife appeared on the citadel walls with their 2 children. She denounced her husband publicly for surrendering. She dressed her children in their finest clothes and embraced them. And then she threw her children into the flames of the burning citadel and jumped after them. She is never named in the sources. She is just the wife of Hasdrubal. Everything else about her, her name, her age, her life before the siege, is gone. But this one moment, this last act of absolute defiance, survives across 2,000 years. 50,000 survivors, the remnant of what had been one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, surrendered. They were enslaved. The city was systematically looted. The buildings were burned. Polybius writes that he watched Scipio watching the burning city, and that Scipio wept. He recited, the ancient account says, lines from Homer about the fall of Troy, and told Polybius that he feared that one day someone would say the same things about Rome. Whether this story is exactly true or not, it has the quality of something a perceptive man in that moment might actually feel. The complete destruction of a great civilization by human agency, witnessed by the man responsible for it. It is hard to look at something like that and not think about what it means. The ruins were then systematically demolished. Whatever the fire had not taken, Roman work crews pulled down. The population that had not been killed in the fighting had been enslaved. In the next generation, the site was turned over to farming by Roman settlers. Later, a Roman colony was established there, and still later, Roman Carthage became one of the great cities of the Roman Empire. But that was a different city entirely, built on the bones of the old one. The story about Rome salting the earth of Carthage, making it permanently infertile so nothing would ever grow there, is almost certainly a later invention. There is no contemporary evidence for it. The Carthaginian land was far too valuable to Roman agriculture to be rendered infertile. The story arose in the medieval period and was attached to this event, probably because it felt like what Rome would have done. The symbolism was too perfect not to believe. What Rome actually did was erase Carthage from the official record. The city was declared to no longer exist. Its language was suppressed. Its books were burned, with the single exception of Margot's agricultural manual. Its gods were not incorporated into the Roman pantheon, the way the gods of other conquered peoples usually were. Baal, Hammon, and Tanit simply stopped being worshipped in their old forms. Their temples were gone, their priests were dead or enslaved. The tradition of their worship did not survive the transition. Carthage, which had been for centuries one of the most powerful cities in the Western world, was made into nothing. And for a very long time, it almost worked. The story of Carthage is also the story of what fear does to power. Rome, in 149 BCE, was not afraid of Carthage in any rational military sense. The treaty that ended the Second Punic War had stripped Carthage of its fleet, its elephants, its capacity for independent foreign policy. The Carthage that Cato visited on his diplomatic mission was a prosperous trading city with no army worth mentioning, paying its war indemnity on schedule, governed by an oligarchy that had no appetite whatsoever for another conflict with Rome. By any objective measure, it was not a threat, but fear is not always rational, and what Rome feared about Carthage was not its armies, it was its wealth, its demonstrated capacity to recover, its continued existence as a center of Semitic Mediterranean culture, a reminder that the world had not always been Roman and did not have to remain Roman. The merchants of Carthage were competing effectively with Italian merchants in North Africa and in the Western Mediterranean trade. The city was growing richer. The agricultural hinterland was productive. Another generation, 2 generations, and Carthage would have been wealthy enough to rebuild whatever it chose to rebuild. Cato looked at that and saw something that had to end before it could become dangerous again. He was wrong about the threat, but he was not wrong about the trajectory. Carthage was recovering. Without the Punic Wars, with another century or two of peace, it would have been a very different power from the one that had fought Rome. But it would have been a power. Rome chose not to find out what that power might have been. The Third Punic War lasted 3 years, from 149 to 146 BCE, and for most of that time the Romans achieved very little because the Carthaginians, facing destruction, fought with the kind of desperation that makes people capable of things they would not otherwise be. The city's walls were 10 meters thick in places. The harbor was defended. The garrison, though small by the standards of the Great Wars, was capable and determined. For 2 years, Roman armies camped outside Carthage and could not get in. What finally broke the stalemate was Scipio Aemilianus, and what he brought to the siege was not primarily military genius, though he had that. It was organizational competence and the patient willingness to do what needed to be done systematically. He built the mole to cut the harbor. He built a wall of circumvallation around the city to cut off its land connections. He waited. He tightened the ring. He did not hurry because hurrying had not worked, and he understood that, inside the city, during those final months, what was happening is something we can only partially reconstruct. The ancient sources describe the defense with considerable detail because there were Romans close enough to observe parts of it, and because Polybius was there to record what he saw. The population was starving. The available food was being rationed and then rationed again. Disease was moving through the crowded streets. The Carthaginian commander Hasdrubal, who was not the great Hasdrubal of the Second Punic War, but a man of the same name, who had taken command of the city's defense, maintained order through the force of his personality and a willingness to execute those who suggested surrender. What the people of Carthage thought during those final months is something we will never know directly because they left no record that survived. But there are fragments. There are the inscriptions that were made right up to the end, votive offerings to Tanit and Baal Hammon that continue into the final years of the city's existence, people praying, people maintaining the relationship with their gods, even as everything collapsed around them. That continuity of religious practice in extremity speaks to something deep about the human relationship with the sacred. Whatever else was happening, people were still asking for what they needed from the powers they believed in. There are also the objects, the personal items buried with the dead in the city's cemeteries, continuing through the period of the Third Punic War. Jewelry, amulets, the small terracotta figures of the goddess. These objects represent choices made by individual people about what mattered, what should accompany the dead, what should be held close. They are not military or political objects, they are intimate ones. And there is the tophet, still being used in the final years. Whatever its specific religious function, it was maintained to the end. The urns continued to be placed. The prayers continued to be made. The city was alive, right up to the moment it stopped being alive. That is both obvious and worth saying. 700 years of continuous human habitation and culture, and then the fire, and then the silence. The silence lasted, in its most complete form, for about a century. Roman Carthage was founded by Julius Caesar in 44 BCE, though the actual establishment of the colony happened after his death under Augustus. The city that grew there over the following centuries became one of the most prosperous in the Roman Empire, a capital of Roman North Africa, a center of early Christianity where Tertullian and Cyprian and eventually Augustine would work. The Latin of Roman Carthage produced some of the most important Christian theological writing of the patristic period. The city was again, for several centuries, a great city. But it was not Carthage. It spoke Latin, not Punic. It addressed the Roman gods and then the Christian god. Its harbor was in the same place, and its hill was the same hill. But it was a different civilization built on the bones of the previous one. The people who lived there knew, in some dim cultural sense, that they were not the first. The place had a history, but the history was mostly inaccessible to them, buried under their own streets, and written in a language that was fading from common use. Augustine, writing at the end of the Roman period in North Africa, mentions that Punic was still spoken in some rural areas. He uses it occasionally to make etymological points. He was aware that the people he ministered to had a pre-Roman, pre-Christian past that stretched back much further than the Roman colony. Whether he understood the depth and sophistication of that Punic past is harder to say. The intellectual framework he was working within did not have much room for taking Carthage seriously on its own terms. The Vandals sacked Roman Carthage in 439 CE, establishing their own kingdom in North Africa that lasted until the Byzantine reconquest in 534 CE. The Arabs arrived in the 7th century, and their conquest established the demographic and cultural foundations of the North Africa we know today. Each of these layers of history sits on the previous ones, and beneath all of them, in the deepest strata, Punic Carthage. The archaeologists who have worked this site over the past century and a half have had to move through all those layers to reach the earliest ones. French colonial archaeology in the 19th and early 20th centuries did important foundational work, but was conducted with the assumptions and methods of its time, which sometimes meant that lower strata were disrupted in the process of reaching them. Modern archaeology is more careful, more systematic, more aware of what can be learned from context rather than just from objects. The picture is getting better. It will never be complete. But here is what the picture shows, incomplete and fragmentary as it is. A city of extraordinary sophistication and ambition. A people of genuine intellectual and commercial achievement. A civilization that engaged with the wider world on its own terms for 7 centuries, that sent explorers to the edges of the known world, that developed agricultural science that outlasted it, that built harbors that still impress engineers today, that addressed its gods with an intimacy and devotion that is recognizable across the full distance of time. And a civilization that was destroyed, not by natural disaster, not by the inevitable weight of time, but by a specific political decision made by specific people who had the power to act on it and chose to do so. That distinction matters. Civilizations end in many ways. Drought, disease, internal collapse, the gradual fading of the conditions that made them possible. These are endings that carry a different weight from deliberate destruction. Carthage was deliberately destroyed. Its ending was chosen by its enemies, not inflicted by impersonal forces. Knowing that does not change what happened, but it changes, slightly, how we hold what happened, with a little more specificity about where the responsibility lies, with a little more clarity about what it means when a powerful civilization decides that a less powerful one should not exist. Those decisions are not ancient history. They have been made at many points in human history. And the logic that drives them, the logic of Cato standing in the Senate and saying Carthage must be destroyed without offering any military or practical justification, just the assertion that its existence was intolerable, is not a logic that belonged only to ancient Rome. The story of Carthage is old enough that we can tell it at a safe distance, old enough that the specific political stakes are gone, that no one alive has a grievance about what happened in 146 BCE that needs to be addressed. But the pattern that the story traces is not safely distant. It is a pattern that keeps recurring. The powerful deciding that the existence of the less powerful is unacceptable. The framing of that decision as necessity or justice or defense. The destruction that follows. The silence. And then, eventually, the recovery of what was there. Incomplete, partial, filtered through the perspectives of those who did the destroying, but persistent. The fragments surviving. The questions not fully answerable, but not fully suppressible either. Carthage is still being recovered, piece by piece, from the ground where it was buried. That recovery is a kind of justice, small and delayed, and never complete, but real. The urns in the Tophet are real. The harbour basins are real. The inscriptions are real, and the people who made them were real, and their prayers were real, and their city was real, and it was great, and it deserved better than what it got. That is not a complicated thought. It is just a true one. The night is very quiet now. The story has been told, as much of it as can be told. There is more that cannot be told because it is gone, and that absence is its own kind of presence, the shape of what the silence has swallowed. Somewhere in Tunisia, in the city that was built on top of the city, in the museum that holds the objects recovered from the deepest layers, there is a small terracotta mask, grotesque, expressive, probably apotropaic, made by a Carthaginian craftsperson at some point in the centuries when the city was alive. It has been in the earth for more than 2,000 years, and it survived. Whatever it was meant to ward off, it outlasted everything, including the people who made it. That is the thing about objects made with care. They outlast almost everything. The care goes into them and stays there, waiting to be recognized by whoever comes later, and holds them, and wonders what they meant to the person who made them. Someone made that mask. Someone fired it in a kiln, and let it cool, and took it to a sanctuary and gave it to the care of the gods. And 2,000 years later, it is still here. Carthage is still here. Not as a city, not as a people, at least not in the form it knew itself, but as a presence in the record of human experience, as a question that is not fully answered, as a loss that is still being measured. That is enough to know, before sleep, that something was here, that it mattered, that it is not entirely gone. For almost 2,000 years, Carthage was exactly what Rome wanted it to be. A warning, an example, a city that had dared to challenge the greatest power in the Mediterranean world, and had been punished so completely that there was nothing left to learn from. The narrative of history was written by Rome, and in Roman history, Carthage was the villain, treacherous, cruel, a civilization that sacrificed its children and that deserved what it got. The word Punic, derived from the Latin for Phoenician, gave English the word Punic, meaning treacherous. The phrase Punic faith, fides punica, was a Roman insult meaning the kind of faithlessness and deception that Carthaginians supposedly practiced routinely. 2,000 years of Roman storytelling shaped how the Western world thought about Carthage, and since the Western world's intellectual tradition flowed primarily through Rome, the Carthaginian perspective had no channel to flow through. It was not until the 19th century that anyone began to seriously try to recover what had actually been lost. The archaeology of ancient Carthage is one of the great frustrating puzzles of the discipline. The city that modern excavators have found is, in its deepest layers, genuinely extraordinary. The artificial harbour complex, the Kothan, has been partially excavated and its design confirmed by underwater archaeology. The circular military harbour, the island at its centre, the covered ship sheds, the admiral's quarters, all of it matches what the ancient descriptions said. The Tophet has been excavated in detail, revealing its thousands of urns and the complicated questions they raise. Parts of the residential city have been uncovered, showing the multi-story construction, the sophisticated drainage systems, the fine mosaic floors of wealthy homes. But over it all lies Roman Carthage, the prosperous Roman city built on the same ground and in some cases using the same foundations. And underneath Roman Carthage, the Punic levels are fragmentary, burned, deliberately destroyed. The archaeologists who have worked the site for generations have had to piece together a picture from shards and foundations and the impressions left in soil by things that no longer exist. It is like trying to read a book where most of the pages have been torn out and burned, and the remaining pages are written in a language that only a handful of scholars can partially read. The Punic language is one of the great enigmas of ancient linguistics. It is a Semitic language, related to Hebrew and Aramaic and Ugaritic, and in its later forms it was called Neo-Punic, and persisted as a spoken language in North Africa for centuries after the destruction of Carthage. St. Augustine, writing in the 4th century CE, mentions Punic as still being spoken in his region of North Africa, and he himself may have had some familiarity with it. There are inscriptions in Punic and Neo-Punic that can be partially read by scholars trained in Semitic languages, but the vocabulary is incomplete, the grammar is imperfectly understood, and the great literary texts that would give us real access to the language and the culture, the histories, the poetry, the religious texts, the philosophy, if there was any, are gone. What remains is inscriptions. Thousands of them, found across the former Carthaginian world, in North Africa and Sardinia and Sicily and Spain. Most of them are votive inscriptions, dedications to Baal, Hammon and Tanit from worshippers offering gifts or prayers. A few are administrative or legal texts. There are very few narrative texts. No histories written by Carthaginians about Carthage. No Carthaginian accounts of the wars with Rome. No Carthaginian version of events. This absence is one of the most profound intellectual losses in human history. Everything we know about what Carthage thought of itself, what it valued, how it understood its own story, comes to us filtered through the perspectives of people who were at war with it. The Greek and Roman sources on Carthage are often vivid and detailed, and they contain real information about real events. But they are told by people who had reasons to portray Carthage in particular ways, who had cultural prejudices they did not examine, and who had access only to what was observable from the outside. What did Carthage think about itself? What did its people believe happened in the First Punic War from their side? What did Hannibal's soldiers sing around their campfires in the Italian mountains? What stories did Alyssa's descendants tell about the woman who founded their city? What prayers did ordinary people offer to Tanit when they were frightened, or grateful, or in love? We do not know. We cannot know. And that not knowing is itself one of the most powerful things about Carthage. It is a civilization defined for us almost entirely by its enemies, a people known almost entirely through the words of those who destroyed them. There are places in the ancient world where you can still feel a civilization's presence in the landscape, even after the people who made it are gone. The Greek temples on the Sicilian coast catch the afternoon light in the same way they have for 25 centuries. The Roman Forum still organizes the space of a city even now. The pyramids of Egypt need no explanation to communicate something of the people who built them. The hill of Bursa still exists. You can stand on it today in modern Tunis and look out over the bay in the same direction Alyssa looked when she chose this ground. The harbour basins are still there, silted up and partially built over, but recognizable in their shape. The water is still the same colour it has always been, the particular blue-green of the Mediterranean that catches the light differently at every hour of the day. And underneath the hill, underneath the Roman city built on top of Punic Carthage, in the layers of burned debris and broken pottery and scattered coins, the fragments are still there, patient under the earth, waiting to be read. Archaeology is a discipline of extraordinary patience and extraordinary frustration, because every answer produces more questions, and every fragment recovered from the earth reveals another absence. But the story of Carthage is gradually, piece by piece, becoming more complete. Isotope analysis of the bones in the Tophet urns can tell us where the children were born, what they ate, how old they were. Chemical analysis of the sediment in the harbour basins can tell us what cargoes passed through. The distribution of Carthaginian pottery and coins and amphora across the Mediterranean maps the trading network with growing precision. The DNA of the skeletons found in Carthaginian cemeteries is beginning to tell us about where people came from, how the population mixed over centuries, the genetic reality of what Punic actually meant in terms of human beings moving through the world. It is slow work, but it is happening. And there is something remarkable about the fact that it is happening. That 2,000 years after Rome destroyed Carthage, as completely as a human settlement had ever been destroyed, people are still working to recover what was there. That the impulse to understand, to recover the lost voice, to give back to the dead city some fraction of the presence it had in the world, has not been extinguished by 2 millennia. There is a Tunisian poet, I will not give you the exact words, but the idea of what was written, who described Carthage as a wound that never healed, a city that was killed so thoroughly that it haunts the place where it was, that the harbour still holds the shape of what was there, that the hill still remembers the weight of the walls, that even the silence over the bay on certain evenings has a quality that feels like something just stopped speaking, just a moment ago, and might begin again. I think about Alyssa sometimes when I think about Carthage, the woman who cut the ox hide into a thread and encircled enough ground for a city, the woman who chose fire over surrender. In the Roman telling, she becomes Dido, the queen who falls in love with Aeneas and destroys herself when he leaves to fulfill his destiny in Italy. In Virgil's Aeneid, the founding document of Rome's origin mythology, Dido is a tragic figure, a great woman brought down by passion, her death a price paid for Rome's eventual greatness. There is something almost unbearably pointed about this, the Romans taking the founder of their greatest enemy and rewriting her story so that even her death serves Rome's narrative. But the real Alyssa, whatever she was not a woman destroyed by love. She was a woman who built something. She took a cut of foreign land and made a city. She took a group of refugees and made a people. She took a hilltop by the sea and made a civilization that would last 700 years and challenge the greatest power in the ancient world. That is not a small thing. Hannibal Barca is one of the most studied military figures in history, which means something interesting. The man who nearly destroyed Rome is remembered in extraordinary detail, in a tradition entirely preserved by Rome. His victories are analysed in military academies. His tactics at Cannae are still taught as a model of battlefield encirclement. His crossing of the Alps is still a subject of active archaeological and historical debate, with researchers working to identify the exact pass he used. He is remembered with a kind of awed respect that Rome could not entirely suppress even when it wanted to. That respect is a form of survival. Carthage was destroyed, but Hannibal was too remarkable to erase. His excellence was so extreme that even his enemies had to preserve the record of it, because military history requires accounting for what actually happened. And what actually happened at Cannae was one of the most extraordinary things that ever happened on a battlefield. Carthage's agricultural science survived similarly. The 28 volumes of Margot were the only Carthaginian texts Rome chose to save, because they were too useful to destroy. The farming knowledge developed over centuries on the North African soil, the techniques of dryland agriculture and olive cultivation and viticulture adapted to the specific conditions of the Maghreb, was preserved in Latin translation and influenced Roman and later European agricultural practice. Even Carthage's greatest enemies in Rome, the men who prosecuted the wars against it and who ultimately destroyed it, were shaped by it. Scipio Africanus was a man made by the challenge of defeating Hannibal. His military thinking, his strategic vision, his political philosophy were all forged in the crucible of the Second Punic War. The Roman practice of military discipline and organization improved dramatically over the course of the Punic Wars, in direct response to the quality of what they faced. Rome became the Rome we know, in significant part, because of Carthage. The most chilling echo of Carthage's story is perhaps the one that is hardest to hold clearly, that a great civilization, one that had produced extraordinary things, extraordinary art and architecture, and agricultural science, and commercial organization, and a tradition of devotion to its gods, that its people maintained for 7 centuries, was destroyed. Not because it was militarily dangerous in 149 BCE. The Carthage that Rome destroyed in 146 BCE was already effectively disarmed. It was destroyed because its existence made powerful people uncomfortable, because Cato, standing in the Roman Senate, looked at a prosperous, peaceful, commercially successful city and decided that it needed to not exist. And because Rome had the power to act on that decision, the language of historical inevitability makes it easy to talk about the fall of Carthage as if it were somehow necessary, as if the arc of events had to come out this way, as if the destruction of a civilization of 300,000 people was simply the cost of Roman greatness. But nothing that happened was inevitable. At multiple points in the story, different decisions could have produced different outcomes. Carthage could have accepted the peace terms offered after the First Punic War differently. Hannibal could have marched directly on Rome after Cannae. Rome could have accepted the peace offered before Zama. Rome could have honored the terms it offered Carthage before the Third Punic War. The destruction was chosen, each step of the way, by people making decisions for reasons that seemed compelling to them in the moment. That is not a comfortable thought, but it is an honest one. We are still not entirely sure what Carthage was. The absence of Carthaginian self-testimony means that we are always working from inference and from hostile or external sources. The question of the Tophet, whether those children were sacrificed or simply buried, has not been definitively resolved and may never be. The details of Carthaginian political organization, its councils and magistrates and assembly, are known in outline but not well understood in depth. The religious practices, the mythology, the stories told at night, the prayers, the art as its makers understood it rather than as Rome looked at it, these things are shadows of shadows. But there is enough there to say with confidence that something real was lost. Something that had its own integrity, its own logic, its own beauty. A city by the sea that had chosen a very specific set of answers to the fundamental questions of how to organize human life, and that had worked through those answers with considerable sophistication over 7 centuries. A people who loved their gods with genuine devotion. Traders who knew the winds and currents of the entire Mediterranean better than anyone else alive. Soldiers who crossed the Alps with elephants because their commander believed it could be done and because they believed in him. Somewhere under the hill of Barca, in layers of ash and broken stone, in the curving shape of the harbour basins that the modern city of Tunis still organises itself around, without quite knowing why, in the few inscriptions that still speak fragments of Punic to the patient scholars who know how to read them, in the urns of the Tophet and the bones inside them, and the questions they will never fully answer, Carthage is still there, still waiting to be understood, still, after all this time, refusing to simply disappear. The night is deep now. The harbour holds still water. The hill is dark against a darker sky. The stars that Carthaginian sailors steered by are the same stars that are outside your window tonight, the same ones Elissa followed when she sailed away from Tyre and did not look back. They have been watching all of it. They have not changed. A woman built a city. The city grew into an empire. The empire challenged the greatest power in the ancient world. Everything burned. And 2,000 years later, someone sits in the dark and tries to remember what was there. That is not a small thing. Sleep well. There is a particular quality to the silence that follows a long story. Not emptiness, but the weight of everything that was said, still settling. Carthage was a long story, longer than most of us remember. Longer than the wars it is known for. Longer than the general who crossed the mountains with his elephants and his army and his impossible faith in what he was doing. 700 years of people living by the sea, reading the water, building the ships, finding the harbours, coming home. The coming home is the part that is hardest to hold on to, because in the end, they could not come home. The home was gone. What was there was gone. What might have been, in the centuries Carthage never got to live, we will never know. But tonight, for a few hours, we tried to find it. We followed it as far as the surviving evidence goes, through the founding and the growth and the wars and the destruction and the long, patient archaeology of recovery. We sat with the questions that will never be fully answered. We held the city in the imagination as a real place where real people lived real lives that mattered to them in the way that all lives matter to the people living them. That is something. Rest now. The sea is still. The stars are still. Carthage is still here.